Blood and Ashes. Chapter 1, The Battlefield and the Stranger. The sky burned red with the dying sun, a fitting omen for the battle that had ended only hours before. The once verdant plains of Raventhorn were now soaked in blood, littered with broken swords and lifeless bodies. The banners of House Varden and House Dreven lay trampled in the dirt, their colors dulled by dust and death. Aelira Varden stood in the midst of it, gripping the hilt of her sword as she surveyed the carnage. The wind carried the stench of death, thick and suffocating, but she had long since learned to ignore it. War had been her constant companion since childhood, a shadow that followed her wherever she went. Her father, King Ronan Varden, had raised her to be a warrior, a leader, one who would carry his legacy forward and crush their enemies. She was his only child, the only heir to House Varden, and that meant she had no room for weakness. Weakness was what got people killed. She had fought well today. The Dreven forces had been pushed back across the river, their advance broken, but they would return. They always did. The war between their families had lasted for over a century, neither side willing to surrender. And yet, for all her father's talk of honor and vengeance, Aelira found herself wondering, was there an end to this? She exhaled sharply, shaking off the thought. Now was not the time. Aelira sheathed her sword and turned to her men. "We ride for the ridge," she commanded. "We need to confirm the Dreven scouts have retreated." The soldiers obeyed without question. Weary but loyal, they knew better than to challenge the Princess of Varden. She had earned their respect in battle, proving time and again that she was more than just a noble's daughter. Mounting her black steed, she led them across the battlefield, the hooves of their horses kicking up dust as they rode toward the hills. The land stretched before them in eerie silence, broken only by the distant cries of the wounded. It should have been a routine scouting mission. It wasn't. The ambush came without warning. Arrows whistled through the air, striking two of her men before they could react. The rest barely had time to draw their swords before the Dreven knights emerged from the trees, their armor gleaming in the fading sunlight. Aelira's heart pounded as she drew her blade, blocking a strike aimed at her head. She twisted in the saddle, driving her sword into the attacker's chest before wheeling her horse around. "Hold the line," she shouted. Her soldiers fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered. The Drevens had planned this well. Aelira cut through another knight. Her breath ragged, her muscles burned, but she refused to slow down. If she stopped, she would die. Then out of the chaos, she saw him, a knight clad in black and silver, moving through the battlefield with deadly precision. His sword flashed in the dimming light, striking down Varden soldiers with practiced ease. He fought like a man who had spent his life in war. And then, as if drawn by fate, his gaze met hers. Aelira knew who he was instantly. Prince Chaol Dreven, the man she had been raised to hate, the man who had slaughtered her people. She had never seen him up close before, only from across battlefields or in war councils where his name was spat like a curse. But now, with nothing but a few paces between them, she could see the sharp angles of his face, the piercing blue of his eyes. There was no cruelty in them, no arrogance, only steel-cold determination. And then he moved. Aelira barely had time to react before he was upon her. Their swords clashed, sparks flying in the air as metal met metal. He was fast, stronger than she expected, but she was not easily bested. She ducked under his next strike, spinning her sword in a deadly arc. He blocked it effortlessly, their faces mere inches apart. "Varden," he said, his voice edged with something she couldn't quite place. "Dreven," she shot back. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw an enemy archer taking aim at her. She had no time to react. But Chaol did. Before she could comprehend what was happening, he lunged, not at her but at the archer. His sword struck first, silencing the threat before the arrow could be loosed. Aelira stared at him, stunned. Why? Why had he saved her? The battle raged around them, but for a single moment, time seemed to slow. Chaol met her gaze again, something unreadable flickering across his face. Then, before she could speak, he stepped back.
"Leave," he said.
Her grip tightened on her sword. "What?"
"You can't win this fight. Go before I change my mind."
The words should have enraged her. should have made her drive her sword through his chest. But something in his eyes stopped her. He was giving her a choice. Aelira's pulse thundered in her ears. She had been taught to see him as a monster. But in this moment, he was something else entirely. The sounds of battle grew distant as she weighed her decision. Then, gripping her reins, she turned her horse and fled. The war would continue. But something had changed. And Aelira Varden was no longer certain which side of it she belonged to.